The Mexican cartels have been a massive thorn in the US side for years. Responsible for billions of dollars worth of drugs flowing into the country, the cartels are death-dealing groups inside their native Mexico, and to the US government at least, a clear and present danger to the American people. They have to be stopped. And the US is about to go to great lengths to get it done. Even Mexico can't believe what the US is about to do to the cartels, as President Donald Trump has just ordered the military to obliterate the dangerous gangs. However, that order hasn't been made public yet. It became known because the New York Times broke the story earlier in August. It says that Trump has signed a secret directive delivered to the Pentagon that provides an official basis for the possibility of direct military operations against a list of Latin American cartel organizations that the US government has deemed terrorist organizations. That order, the New York Times says, has provided the US military with an official basis on which it can conduct targeted military operations at sea and on foreign soil against Mexico's cartels. If the reporting is correct, this means the US has created a framework for potential operations against the cartels beyond its borders. This is huge, and right now it's not exactly clear what this groundbreaking new form of military intervention is going to look like. Options are being drawn by US military officials. The New York Times says that information comes from sources who spoke to the outlet on condition of anonymity. Still, those sources claim to be familiar with the conversations that are happening in the Pentagon right now, and it's standard practice for media outlets not to name their sources when dealing with such sensitive and secretive matters. The subject of those discussions may have already been covered in a Washington Post article, which reported on August 8 that discussions have ranged from using Navy destroyers to launch missiles at cartel leaders or infrastructure, to partnering more closely with Mexican authorities to target the criminal organizations, a US official familiar with the issue said. The Cappy Army YouTube channel says that the latter of these options might involve the US, with Mexican authorization building barracks and safe houses inside Mexico to house special operators who can conduct kinetic or capture missions against cartel members. But right now, the options the Washington Post says are being discussed are speculative. What isn't speculative is that the US has spent the last couple of months making some interesting moves that support the notion that it's getting ready to send the military into Mexico to tackle the cartels. For instance, April saw the US deploy a pair of destroyers as part of border-related missions. The USS Gravely went to the Gulf of Mexico, followed by the USS Spruance, which deployed from San Diego to support northern border operations of the US West Coast. At the time, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, speculated that the ships had been sent on some kind of security mission, likely related to border security. Part of the reason for the move, CSIS says, is that two destroyers floating around near the borders of Mexico and the US sent a very clear message that the US is taking the issue of border security very seriously. Even if those destroyers don't have orders to fire on any cartel ships they may find, their mere presence could serve as a deterrent. Mexico certainly didn't seem too worried, at least at the time. Currently, the only country to raise objections to the deployment has been Cuba, and there is no indication of plans to use the destroyers to conduct kinetic military operations within Mexico, CSIS said back in April. However, the group also pointed out that Trump's increasing rhetoric about using military action against Mexico's cartels could serve as a foreboding sign. Fast forward to today, and those ships being in the Gulf of Mexico take on a whole new meaning. Perhaps they were being positioned well in advance so they would be ready to take action as soon as the US gave the okay. It's not yet known for sure, and maybe it won't be known until the first signs of Trump's approved military actions actually take place. The US has also been increasingly militarizing its border with Mexico. As of April, there are 10,000 US troops spread across the border, which The Independent says is a massive increase over the 2,500 soldiers deployed there under former President Joe Biden. Stryker armored vehicles that were once deployed in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have also started showing up at the border, the BBC says. About 100 of these types of armored vehicles are patrolling the border as of June, along with the 2 ships mentioned earlier, and a small collection of drones and spy planes. The BBC has a different number for the amount of soldiers deployed, however, 8,000 instead of the Independent's 10,000. This militarization has been questioned by some, the BBC reports. It reports that 8,000 people were detained at the border in April 2025. That was 120,000 less than the 128,000 detained in the same month in 2024. Some would argue that this 94% drop is a sign that militarization of the border isn't needed. Others might point to that militarization serving as a deterrent to any potential crossers, which accounts for the lower number. Either way, these moves are all signs that using the military to tackle the cartels has been on the US government's collective mind for a while. The obvious question now is, what does Mexico have to say about all of this? A response from the Mexican government came on August 9, which was a day after the New York Times published its report. The country's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, declared, "The United States is not going to come to Mexico with the military. We cooperate, we collaborate, but there is not going to be an invasion. That is ruled out, absolutely ruled out." That seems to be in line with Mexico's previous responses to the US attempting to use its military to battle the cartels. Back in May, and not long after the US sent its destroyers into the Gulf of Mexico, Trump revealed that he had asked Sheinbaum to allow US troops into Mexico to tackle the drug cartel problem. Again, Sheinbaum mentioned she'd be happy to cooperate with the US, but that stopped short of allowing the country's military personnel to operate on Mexico's territory. Trump commented at the time,
"If Mexico wanted help with the cartels, we would be honored to go in and do it. I told her that I would be honored to go in and do it. The cartels are trying to destroy our country. They're evil. The president of Mexico is a lovely woman, but she is so afraid of the cartels that she can't even think straight."
Barely veiled insult aside, it looks like Trump had wanted military intervention for months, and each time it's been brought up, Mexico shot him down. Now, it looks like there's a secret order in place that authorizes the use of the US military to tackle the cartel issue, which leads right back to a question touched upon earlier. What would US military intervention against the cartels even look like? The destroyers in the Gulf of Mexico may offer a hint in terms of the US potentially creating a small naval blockade to stop drug-running ships from entering the country. US-Mexican Ambassador Ronald Johnson has also published a statement released right around the time that news broke of Trump's secret order. "This is not about the United States acting alone," he said. "It's about building a joint, unshakable front with Mexico to defend our citizens, dismantle the cartel's networks, and ensure that the only people who need to fear for their future are those who profit from murder, addiction, and chaos." Again, the notion of collaboration comes into play, suggesting that any use of the US military won't involve ships, soldiers, and aircraft heading into Mexico without the express permission of the country's president. But if that's the case, then why sign an order? This need for collaboration was precisely where the US was back in May, when Trump revealed that Sheinbaum had refused US military help in the first place. Perhaps what's happening, through both Johnson's statement and Sheinbaum's mentions of collaboration, is a set of carefully crafted diplomatic messages designed to hide what may be going on behind the scenes. After all, there's a lot more naval action going on than a pair of US destroyers sailing around in the Gulf of Mexico. On August 15, CNN revealed that the US military is deploying over 4,000 naval personnel, including Marines, to the waters around Latin America and the Caribbean. These sailors aren't taking part in an exercise, the outlet says. They're entering these waters as part of the US plan to combat Mexico's drug cartels. They represent a dramatic show of force that will give the president a broad range of military options should he want to target drug cartels, CNN reports. Specifically, the US has sent the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit and the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group to the US Southern Command, which CNN says is part of a broader plan to reposition naval assets in the region that's been underway for about 3 weeks. Note that Trump's supposed secret signing of the order that US troops could tackle the cartels was reported on August 8. That order may have been signed a lot earlier. What this move gives the US is a nuclear-powered attack submarine, several destroyers, a guided missile cruiser, and some P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft, all of which now seem to be positioned within striking striking distance of Mexico and other Latin American countries that have issues with cartels. As Cappy Army puts it, the US is rolling deep with this deployment, perhaps using it as a show of force to showcase that it's serious about using its military to tackle the cartels. The US also seems to be preparing for the possibility that it won't be able to send soldiers into Mexico. On August 14, Al Jazeera reported that the US Treasury Department has officially sanctioned a pair of Mexican cartels, Los Viagras and Carteles Unidos, along with 7 individuals associated with these cartels, while alleging that they're terrorists. Bounties have also been put in place, totaling $26 million, on 5 of the leaders of Carteles Unidos, the State Department announced on the same day. Those bounties are payable upon the arrest and conviction of the 5 cartel leaders in any country, opening the door for people inside Mexico to try to take the law into their own hands. Except that might not be the real purpose of the bounties. Cappy Army says these bounties may be designed more to create paranoia inside the cartels, rather than as serious attempts to convince people inside Mexico that the juice is worth the squeeze when it comes to tackling these dangerous individuals.
It plants the idea that loyalty to the leader can be monetized by betraying him. It's the increased paranoia in that inner circle. If someone put a bounty out on me, I'd be looking around thinking, which one of my friends is going to sell me out for $50 million? That's why I don't have any friends, so no one can even threaten to betray me.
Perhaps these are the beginnings of a divide and conquer strategy at play here. Offering the bounties creates distrust inside the cartels. If cartel leaders happen to be captured as a result, then great. If not, the division makes it all the easier for the US military to swoop in when the time comes, as well as disrupting cartel operations. Mistakes get made when organizations aren't united, and the US may be counting on that fact as part of its larger plan to handle the cartels with its military. However, this is all speculation. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, the New York Times says that the order Trump has signed is secretive, meaning it's not yet known what options have been agreed upon and what strategies are either being used or going to be used. All that can be reported are on the actions the US is taking right now that seem to be linked to the order that Trump signed. The US certainly isn't saying much more. When the New York Times asked for a response to Trump's supposed authorization of military force against the cartels, White House spokeswoman Ann Kelly delivered a pretty generic response via email. President Trump's top priority is protecting the homeland, which is why he took the bold step to designate several cartels and gangs as foreign terrorist organizations, she said. As for the US Defense Department, it declined a request for a comment. So, not a lot was said there then. The one thing known for sure is that Trump's order, along with everything that's being seen from the US in terms of border militarization, naval deployments, and bounties, represents a massive escalation from the past approach of using drones and spy planes to keep an eye on the cartels. The US is getting serious. It will argue that the use of military force is justified because of the sheer scale of the drug problems the cartel creates in the US. Cartel-provided fentanyl has been a big focus for Trump even before he became president, and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard said in March that cartels were largely responsible for the deaths of more than 54,000 US citizens from synthetic opioids in the period between October 2023 and October 2025. NPR reports that the US intelligence community's annual threat assessment offers a slightly different number of around 52,000, but the point remains that Trump's aggressive military move is focused on tackling the US drug problem. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention offers yet another number, linking 84,000 people to drug-related deaths. However, it incorporated methamphetamine and other street drugs into its numbers, though all are still provided by the cartels. So, the US reasoning for wanting military action is clear. But the question remains, can the US even send troops into Mexico? Not without the approval of the country itself, at least if the US wants to deploy these troops legally. The New York Times notes that several past uses of the US military to tackle the drug issue overseas have pushed at the edges of legal limits without blowing past them. It highlights the example of former President George H.W. Bush sending 20,000 soldiers into Panama in 1989 to arrest Manuel Noriega, who'd been indicted on drug charges in the US. That operation, which resulted in Noriega being ousted, was at least framed as the US military providing support to local law enforcement. What the US now seems to be suggesting for Mexico is much different. If done without Mexico's consent, military action against the cartels would be a major breach of international law, retired Rear Admiral James E. McPherson tells the New York Times. However, the workaround for that appears to be the US designating the cartels it wants to target as foreign terrorist organizations. Mentioned previously was a couple of cartels being added to the list in August, but Trump actually signed an executive order to classify certain international cartels as foreign terrorist organizations back on January 20. It's one of the first things that Trump did when he entered office. Even so, there are legal questions to answer. Can the US military even kill a cartel member without it being considered outright murder under international law? Possibly. There is a self-defense exception to the global assassination ban that the US has used to justify the killings of people it classifies as foreign terrorists before, on the grounds that they represent a danger to the homeland. However, former State Department Attorney Brian Finucane says it might be difficult to argue this exception applies to possible cartel members. Under traditional executive branch lawyering, it would be hard to see some random drug trafficker meeting the threshold for the self-defense exception to the assassination ban, Finucane tells the New York Times. Even capturing instead of killing cartel members creates potential legal problems if done by the military without involvement from any other recognized law enforcement agency. Under what scope could the military hold such prisoners? Would it need congressional authorization? Will those prisoners simply be transferred to the Justice Department upon capture? These are all questions that will need to be answered before any military intervention goes ahead. What happens if one of the military vessels the US has sent into the Gulf of Mexico and the waters around Latin America blows a cartel boat out of the water? Again, questions upon questions. And this all still seems to rely on the US getting permission from Mexico to use its military in the first place. But assume for a moment that all of these legal and consent issues work themselves out. Mexico says yes, the international law issues disappear, the US military rolls in to take the fight to the cartels on Mexican soil and in the waters surrounding Mexico and the United States. Will that approach be effective? It's possible. The divide and conquer strategy previously mentioned may be in play thanks to the US bounties being placed on the cartel leaders' heads. On a wider level, it's important to recognize that the cartel isn't one big organization. There are many cartels in Mexico, some of which cooperate while others fight among themselves. As recently as May 2025, Insight Crime reported that the infamous Sinaloa cartel, once led by the notorious El Chapo, seems to be on the verge of fading out of existence amongst infighting and gang warfare inside Mexico. Perhaps that's something the US military could take advantage of. Disrupting cartel operations with its ships could be accompanied by a strategy where it takes out the heads of the various cartels inside Mexico via ground operations. With the heads cut off, the cartels might descend into anarchy and infighting, destroying themselves from the inside while the US military keeps its focus on members who seem to be rising into positions of power. That could be an ideal scenario for the US, but the cartels are often decentralized, and it's unlikely that heads of the organizations are going to hang around in their strongholds once they receive word that the US military is on the way. And again, this all assumes permission is received, because US soldiers operating inside Mexico against people who are technically civilians, even if classified as foreign terrorists, is legally spurious at best. So, a lot of questions remain unanswered. Perhaps more information will emerge soon as the US starts to execute plans based on Trump's secret order. Now, Mexico isn't the only country where US troops may soon be operating. In fact, American soldiers are also working alongside their NATO colleagues close to the border of the Russian exclave Kaliningrad. The 2nd Cavalry Regiment has rolled into Poland, and Kaliningrad is on edge. Learn why in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more videos covering the latest US military developments.